Hello, the Economancer here once again, back with a riveting tale from the Economicon. If you don't know, previously we have been working on going through inequality in society, social science perspectives on social stratification. But today is going to be a little bit different. I had a friend of mine contact me with a question. And he was talking about, I consistently hear people talk about trickle-down theory. How does that work in context of inequality? And why do we use the term trickle-down theory? Well, if you've ever read anything by Thomas Sowell, he points out that there's actually no economic theory known as trickle-down theory. However, that's partially incorrect. One of the early pioneers in regional development economics, Hirschman, he had stated that one of the major theories for development strategy in regional economics was to utilize geographic growth centers. And he recognized that these polarization effects would be overtaken by what he called trickling down of progress. And that in this regard, there would be some semblance of, interregional as well as international inequality. And what he meant by that is if we assume that there's going to be agglomeration, so one spot in a region is going to maximize growth, whereas the other ones kind of like fall behind, then you're going to have, this unequal distribution of income, unequal distribution of human capital, because you're going to pull human capital from the rural areas. And overall, you're just going to have inequality as a general rule. So this is kind of the formation of what became trickle-down economics, which essentially is just supply-side economics. And what that means is to try to limit the amount of government interference into the market so that the market can allocate resources as efficiently as possible. If you are under the assumption that the market allocates resources better, then you would assume that limiting the amount of government intervention is probably what's best. Now, this doesn't mean that it's always what's best. It just means that we really need to limit the government so that whatever negative effects can happen are limited in capacity, whereas you can have the government interfere in whatever might be a negative effect, so whatever negative externalities you may have. And this is something that he talked about, Hirschman talked about quite often, was that, if we put a little bit of public and private spending into these, these growth centers, then we should assume that there's going to be some spillover effect, this trickling down effect into, not just the growth economy, but into all economies in that regional area. And then you could also apply that internationally and say, places like the United States. As it grows, there's a spillover effect from our human capital and other capital accumulation that goes into other countries. And this, for the most part, is true. However, there were other individuals during this time, such as Perot, and then, the godfather of accumulation causation theory. You have Friedman's core periphery model, and then cumulative causation by Gunnar Myrdal. Both of these individuals pointed out to the negative aspects that are associated with this growth and not having the government interfere. So ultimately, they had, processed the idea that, one, you could have government intervention not into the growth centers because those are already growing and they're already accumulating all of this capital and human capital, whereas the rural areas, they're getting drained. They're having brain drain because all the human capital is leaving there. And then they're going to the big cities. So how do we How do we fix this? What can we do? And so they said, well, don't bring government intervention into the big area, bring it into the rural area. Make sure that you're increasing education opportunities. Make sure you're increasing, entrepreneurial activities in these areas. And all of that seems relatively good because you have these two different ideas. You can either have a balanced growth path where almost everyone is benefiting from the growth, or you can have an unbalanced growth path where you have this one growth pole that's just shooting up, and then you're hoping that those effects spill over to the other parts of the economy. Now, there's a lot to be said about this as a general rule. Which one is better? Well, that's really kind of a cultural question almost, because depending on the population's tastes and the government's tastes for redistribution as well as interference into the market, we could say that it would be maximally beneficial for you to want a balanced growth path. So if you have a very high taste for redistribution, as well as like taxation and stuff like that for your culture, society, and economy, then a balanced growth path by, pushing to all sectors of the economy, public infrastructure and stuff like that, then yeah, that's going to be the optimal solution. Whereas if you are in if you're in an economy, society, or culture that, doesn't mind hierarchies, actually prefers them, then an unbalanced growth path may be the way to go. But that's something that, and the reason why this got pushed down so much to regional economics is because it's really hard to make that decision on the macro scale, right? So let's just take Darren Acemoglu. He wrote a paper, Why Aren't We All Scandinavians? And he kind of broke down this, this capital asymmetry and human capital asymmetry that happens in the world. And essentially what he said is, you have places like the United States, they have cutthroat capitalism, and then you have places like the Nordic countries that have cuddly capitalism. And he says, essentially, if you tried to make the United States a more cuddly capitalistic economy, you would slow a lot of its highly progressive technological breakthroughs and frontiers. Now, people would be in general possibly better off, but would that necessarily make the whole world better off? We don't actually know, because we would actually slow down that technological frontier, and then we wouldn't have as much major spillover effects into the real economy from this in other countries. So would it be beneficial for them to have us be that way? Because it may be more beneficial to us, especially in the short term, but how does that look in the long run? And so these are all the things that you have to take into consideration. Now, what do we do about the inequality that's created? So let's just say we're going to do the unbalanced growth path. We really are going to focus heavily into these growth centers and expect spillover effects. I'm actually not opposed to Adam Smith's ideas and, making sure that we're maintaining high levels of education, even in the places that aren't getting the technological spillovers. So what I mean by that is, if we're assuming that the research and development done by these large corporations and stuff like that are actually having spillover effects into the real economy, it's going to be mostly regional based. So we really got to try to push those developments out as much as possible through, public infrastructure and public education, as well as we also need to understand that we're going to have removal of human capital, whatever has been gained in these rural areas, into the growth pole centers. So how do we go about affecting this? Increases in education, first and foremost, that needs to happen. Now, does this necessitate the need for high levels of redistribution of wealth? That's debatable. We could say that yes, it would be, more beneficial to society. This is kind of the Piketty idea to increase taxes. Now, this is not just Piketty's idea, and what I mean by that, this is what's called the Rawlsian theory. So Rawls had basically come up with the assumption or hypothesis, however you want to state, is that if we aggregate up the utility function from all people, those at the bottom of the curve, they have a steeper part of the curve. So $1 change in their utility is a more beneficial or a more utility maximizing part of the function. Whereas at the top, where you have rich people, it's almost a flat line. Like $1 to a billionaire isn't going to make any difference. Whereas $1 to someone who's very poor, almost near abject poverty levels, that $1 difference is huge in utility. So if you're trying to maximize total utility, you're going to want to give those on the bottom end of that curve, those in the lower classes, more money. And that means they're going to have more utility. It also, in some instances, may raise consumption. Now, that's neither here nor there, because consumption works very oddly. Because if you take into just, the strict neoclassical idea, or even the new Keynesian, we're going to have people maximize rationally. They're going to maximize their utility rationally. Now, if we apply, behavioral economics or other forms of psychology into it, that may not be true. They may actually maximize what their utility is, but that's not rational. That's bounded rationality. Now, that has to get unpacked, and basically that, due to their cognitive biases, which everyone has, that some people may spend money, for lack of a better term, incorrectly. We can look at lotteries and say, like, oh, well, 70% of people who win the lottery end up going broke within 3 to 5 years, or, they have other negative consequences, gambling addictions, drug addictions, and stuff like that. So once they've had this increased amount of money, that doesn't necessarily help them at all. It actually makes their life worse. Now, there's a few papers that went into this. One was by Kaplan at George Mason. I think he did it through the Mercatus Center. He goes on into this. There's a few behavioral economists that wrote some pretty scathing reviews of this, but as a general idea, I don't think it's necessarily completely incorrect, and it's something that as a society we have to take into account, especially when we're trying to even out the playing field. So another one is the idea of, this intergenerational mobility. So I'm not as concerned about income inequality or economic inequality as I am about the equality of opportunity. So if we're having problems in intergenerational mobility, so people aren't getting the opportunity to go out and get the better jobs, this is probably a function of education, which goes back to my first point. So it's something I want to make sure that we're following through with, is making sure that everyone gets the opportunity to go do this. Now, this goes into what we were talking about, Weber. Is it due to, economic inequality that these people aren't able to get these jobs, or is it, is it status? Is it, party? We're seeing now a large influx of individuals struggling to get jobs due to party affiliation. This creates a level of inequality. So this is something we as a society need to figure out on how we want to allocate the resources that we're going to redistribute. And for me, it would be to maximize intergenerational mobility and to maximize education. Now, what that looks like, there's a lot of policy prescriptions that can be implemented along those lines. Compulsory education, moving to maybe different types of school systems, maybe trying to maximize public, private, and charter schools. If you go into something along the lines of what Thomas Sowell and a few other economists are trying to move towards. And then you could, possibly move the compulsory education age from the age of 16 to the age of 18, as well as, there's some thoughts about increasing the amount of time children are in school. So instead of, 9 months out of the year, push it to 10 to 11, have 1 month off in between. Have additional resources associated with summer schools. So kids who you think may be falling behind, it seems a tragedy that they get these 2 months off to some people, and that they may want to increase the amount of education that their children can gain during that time. And, we don't see a whole lot of grand benefits during this time, during the summer months. So something that would maximize the summer months would help, because 2 months is quite a lot of time when we're talking about human capital accumulation. I mean, if you think about it this way, as you're going up through college, let's just take physics, for example. As you're going through college, once you get to your bachelor's, you're barely beginning to even think about the cutting edge level of technology. You're really spending, so here's an even better case. Calculus 1, 2, and 3 is basically walking you through Leibniz and Newton's discovery of calculus. So you're really starting at the base level, learning just basic tangents, and then you're moving into, uh, you know, uh, derivatives, how those derivatives are, what they mean, and then till you're at calculus 3, where you're looking at shapes, volumes through integration and multiple integration, and then really understanding gradients, so three-dimensional derivatives and stuff like that, or multivariate derivatives, multivariate integration. And then you can move into like differential equations, which it's tacked on, and then matrix algebra. So all of this is built on what's already been hundreds of years ago. And so only until you hit stuff like grad school, and even grad school is almost just catching you up with current, and then the PhD is where you're really trying to motivate something in the future. So missing 2 months every year for 10 years, that's quite a bit of time that you're losing and trying to catch up on all of the, education and human knowledge that's been built up over time. So it's something that might be looked into. As well as there's a lot of ideas out there, not just on human capital, but also bringing back trades. So is that maximally beneficial for an economy that we think that might be moving strictly into technology? I don't know, but we do know that these tasks have to be done, and that if everyone was well versed in them, you would have less predatory issues associated with like plumbing, carpentry, and stuff like that. So if you know more about it, you wouldn't be as liable in someone being predatory against you. So that's something to take into account about increasing overall human capital. And then last is, in these rural areas, there's a lot of feedback effects where individuals want to stay. And so we've kind of got this equilibrium where people want to move because they want to go to where the money is. They want to move because that's where the technology is, but they also want to stay because they're happy where they are for the most part. So how do we balance that? So if people want to stay and they don't want to be agglomerated into these large areas, how are we going to maintain, the benefits for them that's going to spill over? Especially when the United States and other, major countries are trying to deal with what they call urban sprawl. How large can we allow this urban sprawl? One way to think about it is that we can increase, human transference from these areas, and other places have done this through high-speed trains and stuff like that, so we can build an infrastructure that'll allow people to be able to live in the rural areas and transfer into the large cities and the metropolitan areas. And that way you're not having as much drain on that local economy, because I'm still a part of that local economy. My children are going to school there. Even though I'm a function of the big city, I'm still able to live and influence my local area. And so that's something to take into account. And now we move into where we're at now, geographical information technology, especially after Corona, where well, not everybody, but a lot of people are working from home. How does this impact this agglomeration effect? And how does this impact inequality through these agglomeration effects? It very well may put a dampening on it. It very well may increase how we in society are able to equalize these benefits from these growth poles and this trickle-down theory. So ultimately, let's take a step back and look at what we went over. So ultimately, we're talking about growth pole theory. We're ultimately talking about trickle-down economics. How does that work as a function? And we kind of went over that we're assuming that as this one place gets larger, the effects, the technological advancements spills over to the other parts of the economy, and that the other parts of the economy have a slower growth, but they're still on some level of catch up, and that this kind of equalizes the benefits in the long run. and that in the short run, it may be very useful to have some redistribution depending on the society and culture's taste. And then last, what are some policy prescriptions, such as building infrastructure that will allow for more people to get from the rural to the growth pole? And then, how this plays into the geographical information technology now that we're in coronavirus and people are doing a lot of remote work. And then last, how can we increase education in these rural areas, so that they can increase their level of catch up, because they're not getting as much of the technology spillovers from the research and development by private corporations. So we have to kind of utilize the public education system or some form of that to maximize the total human capital, so that these places can catch up, and we don't just focus on just the growth pole centers in that assumption. So I think overall that was what I'm trying to get at. I hope this is informative. I hope this gives everybody an idea of what trickle down, as well as some policy prescriptions, as well as how this affects inequality in our society. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this. Like, share, subscribe, and always come back for more information from the Economicon, because I am the Economancer. Have a good day.